The chandeliers in the east drawing room of Greyhollow Park had been burning for 2 hours by the time the last of the guests arrived, and the whole room had settled into that particular warmth that only candlelight and good company can produce together. Somewhere near the tall windows, a quartet played something light and forgettable, and the sound of it moved over the crowd the way music does at such gatherings. Not quite heard, not quite ignored, just present, the way wallpaper is present. Adeline stood near the fireplace, close to the carved mantel, and she had not moved in some time. She had learned in the 2 years since her marriage that stillness was its own kind of shelter. From a fixed position you could watch without being watched. You could observe your husband work a room and feel nothing more dramatic than a dull, familiar ache, which was easier to manage than surprise. Lord Vincent Gosse was a handsome man, and he had always known it. He moved through the crowd at Greyhollow with the unhurried ease of someone who expected to be welcomed wherever he went, and he was never disappointed. He pressed hands and smiled and leaned toward people in that way he had, that private, conspiratorial lean that made the other person feel singled out, chosen, worth the attention. Adeline had been on the receiving end of that lean once. She remembered it the way you remember the warmth of a fire after you've stepped away and felt the cold. She wore dark green silk, one of 3 gowns she rotated through social occasions. It was becoming enough, she supposed, though she had noticed for some time that no one at these gatherings troubled themselves to tell her so. She kept her hands at her sides, and she watched her husband, and she waited for the evening to end. Then she saw the woman. She came in on Gosse's arm, and she was the kind of beautiful that takes up space, fair-haired, tall, wearing white and pale gold with diamonds at her throat, moving with the practiced confidence of a woman who has never once in her life wondered whether she belonged somewhere. Adeline did not know her. She was certain she had never seen her before, but she watched the way Gosse held that arm, the way his shoulder dipped toward the woman as he walked, and something cold moved through her that she could not quite name. They were heading toward a cluster of important people near the center of the room. An older gentleman with parliamentary connections, a countess whose opinion mattered in the county, and a little apart from them, watching the room with the stillness of a man accustomed to having things brought to him rather than going to fetch them, a tall figure in dark evening dress, whom Adeline did not recognize. Gosse stopped in front of the group. He was smiling. He was always smiling at gatherings like this, his party smile, the one that went all the way to his eyes and meant very little. "May I present," he said, and his voice carried easily, warmly, "my wife." He said it with his hand resting on the wrist of the woman in white. The words reached Adeline the way that very large, very sudden things reach you, slowly, and then all at once. For a breath, perhaps 2, they were only sounds, and then they weren't, and then she understood them. The woman in white dipped a small, graceful curtsy. "Mrs. Gosse," she said, as though trying the name on, as though finding it suited her. The countess said something admiring. The older gentleman bowed, and Lord Vincent Gosse stood in the center of his own performance, golden and at ease, presenting this stranger to the room as the woman who belonged to him. Adeline was perhaps 12 feet away. She had not moved. She did not move now. She made her face calm and pleasant and entirely empty of everything that was happening inside it, which was a skill she had spent 2 years perfecting, and she stood there and she let it happen. And inside her chest, quietly, without any drama at all, something that had been straining toward him for a very long time simply stopped. She believed no one had seen. She was wrong. The tall figure in dark evening dress had not been watching Gosse. He had not been watching the woman in white or the diamonds or the curtsy. From the moment the words "my wife" had left, Lord Gosse's mouth. The Duke of Wrenfield had been watching the woman in green by the mantelpiece. He had seen the precise instant the words arrived. He had seen the small, betraying stillness that moved through her. Not a flinch exactly, more like a person taking a blow underwater, where the impact travels differently and there is no sound. He had watched her decide not to speak. He had watched her fold that decision down and put it somewhere internal and turn her face back to the room as though nothing of consequence had occurred. And he had seen the one thing she had been most determined to conceal, which was that her eyes for the space of a held breath had gone very bright, and that she had not let a single tear fall. The Duke was a man accustomed to knowing things. His position required it. But he stood there in the warm, buzzing room with a glass of champagne going flat in his hand, and he thought, with more urgency than the situation perhaps warranted, if that man is already the husband of the woman in white, then who is she? And why, when he gave away her name in front of a roomful of people, did she not say a word? He intended to find out. Adeline did not sleep that night. She sat by the window of the guest room she had been given at Greyhollow, a smaller room than the one her husband occupied, and she watched the last of the carriages depart down the long gravel drive, and she thought about how she had arrived at this particular evening. Her father, Sir Robert Stowe, had died when Adeline was 19. He had been a quiet man, a scholar more than a gentleman of affairs, and when he went, he left behind a house full of books, a modest number of debts, and a daughter who had nobody and very little prospect of finding anybody. A distant cousin had taken her in, and the arrangement had been one of those understandings where nothing is said aloud but everything is clear. You are here on sufferance, and the cost of your keep is never quite forgotten. Into this life, Lord Vincent Gosse had appeared. He had been charming and attentive, and had asked questions about her father and her interest, and had listened, genuinely listened, which was so unfamiliar a sensation that she had confused it for love. They were married quietly, quickly. Everyone said how fortunate she was. The fortune lasted 6 months. She could not identify the single moment it changed, because it had not changed in a single moment. It had changed the way daylight changes, gradually, and then you look up and realize the room is dark and you do not know when it happened. He became distant. He became irritated with her presence. He stopped bringing her to events, and when he did bring her, he did not stay near her. And when people asked who she was, his answer had the quality of a man naming a piece of furniture. Adeline had told herself this was ordinary married life. She had told herself she was adjusting her expectations. She had told herself a great many things, and she had believed most of them, because the alternative was to admit she had made a terrible mistake, and she had nowhere left to go. But lately, these last months, something had shifted. Gosse had begun to ask about her family, not conversationally, not out of boredom, specifically. Where had her father grown up? Had she any of her mother's relations? What had her grandfather's Christian name been? Did she recall anything of the old house in Devonshire, the one her father had spoken of before he died? She had answered without suspicion, because she had no practice at suspicion. And then she had noticed that the small box of her father's papers, the one she kept beneath the window seat in her room, had been moved. Not taken, moved, searched, and replaced, but not quite right, the latch sitting differently than she had left it. When she went through the contents, the only thing that might be missing, she could not be entirely certain, was a single folded letter, written in an unfamiliar hand and addressed to her father. She had read it once, years ago, without understanding it, and had set it aside as the kind of correspondence that would explain itself in time. It had been signed, "Your mother requires nothing of you. But the child, when she is grown, send her to Crestwood, and what was lost will be returned to her. She had forgotten it until the box was moved. Now she could not stop thinking about it. The Duke of Wrenfield wrote to his solicitor before noon the following day. The letter was brief. It asked for whatever could be found regarding one Lord Vincent Gosse of no particularly distinguished lineage, and it asked, almost as an afterthought, for anything pertaining to the family of his wife, her maiden name, her father, her father's people. He told himself this was idle curiosity. He was not in the habit of concerning himself with other men's domestic arrangements. But the truth was simpler and stranger than curiosity, and somewhere underneath he knew it. He could not stop seeing her face. He had spent the better part of 40 years among people who wore their feelings openly, like decorations, chosen and displayed. He was entirely familiar with performed grief and performed joy and performed surprise. What he was not familiar with, what he could not stop turning over, was a woman who had absorbed a blow of that magnitude in the middle of a crowded room. And not because she was cold, not because she had learned, over a long time and through a great deal of practice, that feeling things in public was a luxury she could not afford. A person only learns that, he thought, if they have been hurt in public before and found no sympathy waiting. He did not know her name yet. He would within the week. The Gosses remained at Greyhollow for a fortnight, as the invitation required, and the Duke, who had intended to leave after 3 days, did not leave. He watched. Every day he found a reason to be in rooms where Mrs. Gosse was, and every day the picture became a little clearer and a little harder to look at squarely. He saw her served last at dinner. He saw that when the party went out riding on the clear morning of the 3rd day, there was somehow no mount arranged for her, and that Gosse had waved a careless hand in her direction and said she would be happier indoors, without consulting her in the matter. He saw her stand on the steps and watch the carriages pull away, and then turn and go back inside with the quiet, unhurried composure of someone who has long since stopped expecting the door to be held. He saw the woman in white, whose name, he learned, was Sybil, move through the party as though she had every right to it. He saw Gosse's eyes follow her across every room. And he saw the thing that decided him. He saw that Mrs. Gosse had stopped expecting anything. She had not grown sullen or reproachful. She had simply, somewhere along the way, retracted all expectation, the way a plant retracts from frost. Not choosing to do so, but because there was nothing else left to do, she moved through the fortnight quietly, composedly, asking nothing and receiving nothing, and appearing to regard this as the natural order of things. He found her alone in the portrait gallery on the 5th afternoon. She was standing before a painting of a woman from the previous century, considering the face with an expression he could not read. She heard him and turned, and the color left her face and came back quickly. She recognized him. He could see her placing him. The man from the circle, the man who had been standing there when Gosse said, "My wife." "I beg your pardon," she said, and her hands came together in front of her. "I'll leave you to it." "You were here first," the Duke said. "If anyone is in the wrong place, it's me." She did not know what to do with that. He took a few steps closer and looked at her, not at the portrait. "You come here often," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "It's quiet," she said. "No one minds me here." He was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice calibrated to carry no weight, "I was there, the first evening, when your husband made his introductions." The blood left her face and returned. She had an answer ready. He could see the shape of it arriving, smooth and complete. "You're mistaken," she said. "I'm a relation of the family, a distant one. My husband is gone these 3 years. Lord Gosse was kind enough to have me here. The lady you saw is his wife." She said it well. She had clearly said it many times in her own mind. It was seamless. "No," he said quietly, "not a contradiction. a statement of something already known. It went straight through the story she had built, straight through 2 years of practice, and found the person underneath. Her eyes filled. She turned sharply toward the painted woman on the wall and fought it the way she always fought it, and one tear escaped before she could close the door on it, and she wiped it away and stood very still with her back to him. "Please," she said. Her voice had gone uneven. "Whoever you are, please don't. I can't bear kindness right now. I've taught myself not to want it, and you're undoing the work, and I still have to go on living in that house, and I can't do it if I remember what it feels like to be seen." A breath. "So please, leave me be." It was the most she had said to any person in months. The Duke was silent, and then he did something she had not expected. He gave her a formal, grave bow, the kind a man gives an equal, and said, "As you wish, forgive the intrusion." And he turned to leave. He was nearly at the door when she spoke. "Wrenfield," she said. He stopped. "They said your name at table," she said. She was still facing the wall. "You're the Duke of Wrenfield." A pause. "I only wanted to know who it was that was kind to me before I forget it happened." Something moved across his face. "You may remember it as long as you like," he said. "I shan't take it back." And then he was gone, and Adeline stood alone among the portraits, with her hand pressed flat against her collarbone, against the small cameo brooch her father had given her the last Christmas before he died, and she could not have said why her heart was beating the way it was. The Duke walked back through the empty house with his jaw set. He had not found what he came to find, but two things stayed with him. The first was what she had said. "I've taught myself not to want it." He had heard a great many sorrowful things in his life. He was not sure he had heard anything more sorrowful than that. The second was smaller. As she had pressed her hand to her chest, her collar had shifted, and he had glimpsed the cameo at her throat. A small oval piece, jet and white, carved in the old style. He had seen that cameo before, not one like it. That one. He could not place where, but the certainty was absolute. He had seen it before, in his own past, in a setting that had nothing to do with a modest woman at an autumn house party. When the packet arrived from his solicitor 6 days later, the Duke broke the wax with hands that were not entirely steady, and read and understood within the first page that the woman in the gallery was not who anyone at Greyhollow believed her to be, including herself. The report began with Gosse, and there was nothing admirable in it. Old name, no money debts in 2 counties. A woman named Sybil, with whom he had kept a sustained and serious connection for some years, a connection that more than one person in his household considered, to all practical purposes, a marriage. And then, a quiet ceremony, 2 years prior, to a young woman of no known family or fortune, conducted with a haste that had struck the officiating clergyman as unusual. It was the second part of the report that made the Duke set the pages down. His solicitor had found, in the public records and in the papers of a now dissolved Halifax firm, that Adeline's grandfather, her mother's father, a man named Rupert Alsonby, whom the family had refused to acknowledge, had made a very considerable fortune in maritime trade, and had left it, at his death, in a formal trust. The terms were specific. The estate and its proceeds were to be held for his daughter's daughter. If such a grandchild could be located, until that grandchild reached the age of 25, at which point the inheritance would pass to her absolutely and in her own name. No grandchild had ever been found. The fortune had sat for 7 years, accumulating quietly, while trustees placed notices and lawyers corresponded, and nothing came of it. The Duke sat back. He knew the trust. He was, in point of fact, one of its trustees. He had accepted the appointment 18 months ago as a favor to an old colleague, and had given it very little thought since, because there had been nothing to think about, no heir. a fortune waiting for a ghost. The ghost was a woman in dark green silk who had stood by a fireplace and been given away in her own name to a stranger and said nothing. And her husband had known. That was the piece that made the Duke rise from his chair and stand very still in the dark. Gosse had not married Adeline out of charity or attraction or even opportunity. He had married her because he had found the connection. Through the letter in her father's papers, through his careful and patient questioning, and he had moved quickly, before she or anyone else could understand what she stood to inherit. He had spent 2 years making her small and dependent and invisible. He had been counting down to her 25th birthday. She would turn 25 in less than 3 weeks. The Duke thought of her served, last at dinner. He thought of her standing in the portrait gallery with her hand over her heart. He thought of "I've taught myself not to want it." He thought of what a man like Gosse would do when the time came. A wife who had been quietly managed into invisibility, whose word carried no weight because no one had been encouraged to credit her for 2 years. A wife who did not know she was worth more than everything Gosse had ever owned or borrowed. He had seen this before. He understood the shape of it entirely. Adeline heard the truth not through a solicitor's report or a revelation staged for her benefit, but through a partially open door on a wet evening, 3 days after the party returned to Gosse's rented townhouse in the city. She had not been able to sleep. She had come downstairs in her robe for a book she had left in the sitting room, moving quietly out of long habit. Because a woman who is not wanted in her own home learns to move through it like a visitor who has not yet been asked to leave. The light was on beneath the study door. She would have passed it without thought. But she heard her own name, and she stopped. Sybil's voice, low and clipped. "She's been different, Vincent. Something's changed. She holds her head differently. I don't like it." And Gosse's voice, easy and a little bored. "She doesn't know anything. You said that last month. And I'll say it next month. She's exactly where she needs to be." A silence. Then how long until the birthday? 19 days. And then a pause, the clink of glass, and then clearly, deliberately, as though he wanted to be understood. "The marriage was a convenience. You know that. You've always known that. Once the money is in hand, she becomes a liability. A confused woman with no family and an unfortunate tendency to imagine things. I've been laying that groundwork for 6 months. The doctor I had in last autumn will confirm whatever I need confirming. Sybil, she's not your wife." "No," said Gosse, and there was a smile in it, the easy, private, sassified smile Adeline knew. "I was already married when I stood in that church. To you, Sybil, 11 years ago in Edinburgh. That certificate is in the top drawer of this desk, and it has never been dissolved, and nothing said over Adeline Stowe in any church means a thing." The silence that followed was total. Adeline stood in the cold passage, with one hand pressed hard over her mouth. She had never been his wife. The church, the ring, the 2 years, none of it had been real. She had spent 2 years making herself smaller, blaming herself for his coldness, working to be a better wife to a man who had never married her at all. Every shame she had carried, every private conviction that she was the problem, it had all been constructed specifically so she would carry it. The shame cracked straight across, and underneath it, rising up clean and sudden, was something she had nearly forgotten she was capable of feeling. Rage, steady, clarifying rage. And behind the rage, quick and cold and clear, "If I was never his wife, he has no power over me. None, not in law, not in truth. The whole cage was made of one lie, and the lie is in pieces." She did not make a sound. She went back upstairs in the dark, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she shook until morning. By the time the light came, she had stopped shaking. Something in her had changed in the night, and would not change back. She thought of the letter from her father's box. What was lost will be returned to her. She thought of the Duke of Wrenfield, standing in the doorway of the gallery, telling her she might remember his kindness for as long as she liked. She wrote him a letter. She wrote it over 2 nights by the end of a candle, choosing every word the way you choose footing on ice, testing each one before trusting it with her weight. She did not put the worst of it on paper, in case the letter was found. She said only that she had learned something frightening, that she believed herself in danger, that she had no one else to ask, and that if he had meant even a part of what his manner seemed to promise in that cold gallery, she begged him to come quickly. Her birthday was in 2.5 weeks. She sealed it, and then she faced the problem she had not let herself think about: how to send it. She could not post it herself. She was not permitted out unaccompanied. The 2 servants answered to Gosse, but there was a girl who came twice weekly from the market with vegetables, a girl Adeline had once helped with a burned hand, quietly and without fuss, when the cook had turned away. The girl had looked at her with the steady, serious gratitude of someone unused to being helped by people above their station. Adeline would trust her. It was the only move she had. She did not know that Sybil had been watching longer. Sybil had noticed the change in Adeline, the small things, the way she held her head now, the way she paused 1 second longer before lowering her eyes. She had noticed, and she had been watching. On the morning the market girl came, Sybil watched from the 2nd-floor landing and saw Adeline slip into the kitchen passage and press a folded paper into the girl's hand in the brief interval between the delivery and the door closing. Sybil did not raise the alarm. She was far too clever for that. She intercepted the girl on the street before she reached the corner, and she was warm and concerned and pressed a coin into the girl's palm for her trouble. And the girl, who had no experience with women like Sybil, gave up the letter without understanding what she had given up and went on her way. And Adeline's one bridge to the outside world was in Sybil's hands before it had gone 100 yards. When Gosse read it, he was very still, and then he laughed, which was worse than any other response Sybil could have predicted. "She's written to Wrenfield," he said softly. "She's run to the one man in England who sits on the Alsonby Trust." He set the letter down. "Do you know, I was wondering how to explain, when the time came, why my poor wife had lost her reason. She's done it for me. A woman who creeps about her own kitchen, presses secret notes to market girls, writes wild letters to a duke she has met precisely once. That is not a well woman, Sybil. That is a woman whose nerves have given way entirely. Anyone can see it." Sybil looked at him steadily. "She'll tell Wrenfield the truth to his face." "She's welcome to try," said Gosse. "By the time he comes anywhere near her, she won't be here." And so began the worst 10 days of Adeline's life. Gosse moved carefully and in the open, which was what made it so difficult to fight. He began speaking of his wife's health, to the neighbors who called, to the physician he brought in, to the housekeeper. His wife was unwell. Her mind had been troubled for some time. She imagined things. She had begun to whisper, to hide papers, to fancy plots against her where there were none. It was a grief to him, he said, and his eyes would go wet as he said it, because he was very good at this. The physician observed the wife, who knew that every person in the house had been turned against her, and who had barely slept in a week, behaved as any frightened person behaves, which is to say, not calmly. And the physician wrote what he was paid to write. They took the cameo. That was the cruelest stroke, and she knew Sybil had suggested it. They came to her room and took the cameo brooch and the box of her father's papers, the letter, all of it. Everything that might prove she had ever been anyone's daughter. When Adeline came back and found them gone, she wept, and searched the room on her hands and knees, and Gosse stood in the doorway with the physician beside him and said quietly, "You see how she is." She understood too late what had been done to her. Her one act of courage, the letter to the Duke, had been made into evidence of her fragility. Every object that might anchor her to her real history was gone, and the story of her illness had been told so thoroughly, and with such practiced sorrow, that if she were to open her mouth and speak the truth, it would sound exactly like what they had named it, the imagining of a woman undone by her own nerves. Her birthday was 6 days away when the carriage came for her. It came in the gray hour before the house was properly awake. She had not slept. She heard the wheels on the cobblestones, and she knew what they meant the way an animal knows a cage from a distance. Gosse came to her room with a man she did not recognize, businesslike, neutral, the sort of man who does difficult things professionally and does not think about them afterward, and a stout woman in dark wool whose expression said she had closed many doors on many desperate people and long since stopped feeling it. "There now," said Gosse, in the soft, sorrowful voice he had been perfecting for 10 days. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. These people are going to take you somewhere quiet, somewhere you can rest. You'll be looked after." "I am perfectly well," Adeline said, quietly, clearly. The clarity of it made something flicker in his face. "You see how it is," he said, turning to the stout woman. One moment rational, the next, he shook his head. Adeline understood that she had nothing left to say that would not be used against her. The bigamy, the trust, the plot, it would all sound like the invention of a woman who had lost her hold on reality. That was the whole design of it. She rose from the bed with what dignity remained to her, and she said only, "May I bring my father's coat? It's cold." Even the stout woman glanced away for a moment at that. They brought her down the stairs. The servants did not meet her eyes. Outside, a plain, dark carriage waited in the gray morning, and Adeline understood that once she was inside it, she would be gone, carried to some house with no name she knew and no road she could find again, to wait, forgotten, while her birthday came and went, and the money passed to the man who had never been her husband. She stood at the carriage door and she thought she had spent her whole life being taken places she had not chosen. This was only the last of them. The stout woman put a hand on her arm to help her up, and Adeline, who had been quiet through all of it, who had been quiet for 2 years, felt the rage from the night at the study door rise up in her one last time, clean and certain and her own. Not quietly, she thought, not this time. She opened her mouth to scream. And that was the moment the second carriage came around the corner. It came too fast for a residential street, the horses foaming and the wheels throwing up mud, and it stopped hard across the mouth of the drive, so the dark carriage could not pass. Before it had properly halted, the door opened and the Duke of Wrenfield swung down without waiting for the step, and he crossed the distance in long strides, and the stout woman let go of Adeline's arm as though she had been stung. "Step away from her." His voice was very quiet. Somehow that was worse than shouting. Gosse recovered first. He always recovered first. "Your Grace," he spread his hands, all warmth and sorrow. "You find us at a difficult moment. My wife is unwell. Gravely so. I'm seeing to her care. However great your concern, I must ask you not to distress her further. She imagines things. She will have written you." "When does she turn 25?" the Duke said. Gosse stopped. It was a small question. It landed like something large. "I don't see what my wife's age has to." 6 days, said the Duke. "She turns 25 in 6 days. And on that day, the whole of the Alsonby Maritime Estate, held in trust these 7 years for the lost granddaughter of Rupert Alsonby, passes to her absolutely and in her own name. I know this, Gosse, because I am one of the trustees who has been guarding that fortune since her grandfather died. I have been guarding it for a ghost." He looked at the plain, dark carriage. "And here you are, 6 days before her birthday, loading that ghost into a carriage bound for somewhere no one will think to look for her." The lane was very quiet. "I wonder," the Duke said, "what a court would make of the timing." Adeline stood between the two men in her father's coat and heard spoken aloud, in a clear and level voice, the thing she had only half understood through a door: a grandfather, a fortune, her own, in 6 days. She heard it, and the whole false shape of her life turned over and showed its other side. Gosse's face had changed. The warmth was gone entirely. What was left was the cold, calculating thing she had glimpsed perhaps twice in 2 years. "She is my wife," he said. "Whatever you believe about trusts and timing, a husband may care for an unwell wife as he sees fit. That is the law. You have no standing to come between a man and his lawful wife. None." There it was, the one wall he believed could not be breached: the marriage, the paper, the 2 years. The Duke understood it. Adeline saw him understand it, saw the check in him, because it was true. As far as any court knew, she was Gosse's wife. A wife could be committed. A trustee could not, on suspicion alone, override a husband's legal authority. They had reached the last wall, and the Duke did not have the key. But Adeline did. She had been standing silent between them, the way she had stood silent her whole life. And she understood now, with a clarity that came from having nothing left to lose, that the one thing capable of saving her was the one thing only she had heard. And that if she did not speak it now, in this street, in this gray light, she would be carried away, and it would die with her. She lifted her head. "He is not my husband," she said. Both men turned to her. "He is not my husband," she said again, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "And I can prove it, because 8 days ago I stood outside that study door and I heard him tell her, Sybil, with my own ears. When he married me in that church, he was already married, to her, in Edinburgh, 11 years ago." Her voice cracked and held. "He said the marriage was worth nothing. He said it himself. He said once the money came, it would no longer matter what became of me, because no one would ask." The silence that followed was the most complete she had ever heard. Sybil, who had been standing apart near the carriage, had gone white to the lips. And the Duke of Wrenfield, who had arrived in that lane believing he had nothing to work with, looked at the woman in the gray mourning who had just handed him the only weapon that mattered, and something passed across his face that was not fury at all. "Say that again," he said softly, in front of a magistrate. "She is raving," Gosse said too quickly. "You see how she is." "Bigamy," the Duke said over him, "is not a domestic matter. A man who has committed it has no wife to manage, no husband's rights, no standing before any law in this country. And a marriage in Edinburgh leaves a public record. Unlike a woman's word, a record cannot be called mad." Gosse looked around the lane, at the Duke, at the man he had hired who would not meet his eye, at the stout woman already edging away, at Sybil, standing perfectly still, watching him. And then Sybil spoke. She had been calculating in her own way, in those 7 seconds of silence, and when she turned to the Duke, she had the expression of a woman who has made an irrevocable decision and intends to make the most of it. "The certificate," she said, "is in the top drawer of the study desk. The marriage was 11 years ago in Edinburgh, and it was never dissolved, because he kept it deliberately, so he could produce it or deny it exactly as it suited him." She looked at Gosse for a long moment, the look of a woman who has given a great deal to a man and has just watched him prepare to walk away clean over her body. "I will give evidence. Everything. The plan, the certificate, the scheme against this woman, all of it. I helped him build the story of her illness. I intercepted her letter to you." Her voice was perfectly steady. "I am not asking for absolution. I am asking for whatever the law allows a woman who tells the truth in the end." Gosse made one attempt, the swift, smooth pivot of a man who has survived by sacrificing others. He turned on Sybil with wet eyes and a soft voice and offered the Duke a sorrowful account of a weak man led astray by a designing woman, of having been deceived as much as Adeline had been. Sybil listened to this without expression. When he finished, she said, "Every word of the scheme was his. I will say so under oath, and the certificate will say it louder." The carriage to the country house was turned back. A magistrate was sent for. The certificate was found exactly where Sybil had said it would be, in the top drawer of a locked desk, genuine and damning, 11 years old. In the street outside the townhouse, in the gray autumn morning, Adeline stood in her father's coat and watched Gosse as the ground shifted finally and irrevocably beneath him. She looked for hatred in herself and found very little. What she found instead was a vast and exhausted stillness, the particular peace of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has, just at last, been allowed to set it down. The Duke came to her when the others were occupied. He crossed the mud and stood before her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She was thin. She had not slept properly in weeks. She knew she looked it. She stood up straight anyway, and she looked him in the face. "You came," she said. "I didn't reach you in time," he said. "If you hadn't spoken—" He stopped. She saw, with some surprise, that the Duke of Wrenfield was not entirely steady. "You saved yourself," he said. "Whatever the world makes of today, the truth is that I stood in that lane with nothing, and it was you who broke him, not I." Adeline looked at him for a long moment. "You told me to remember that kindness existed in the world," she said. "That was all I had. On the worst nights, that was the only thing I held on to." Something moved in his face. "You won't have to hold on to it any longer," he said quietly. "It isn't a memory now, it's here, and it isn't going anywhere." He offered her his arm. And Adeline Stowe, 6 days before her 25th birthday, who had stood at the edge of being lost forever, who had been deceived and diminished and nearly carried off under a lie, looked at the arm the Duke of Wrenfield offered her in the pale morning light. And after a lifetime of going where she was taken, she reached out with her own hand, of her own free will, and took it. The fortune passed to her on the morning of her birthday, formally and in her name, in the offices of 3 gray-soothed solicitors, who addressed her as Miss Alsonby Stowe, and meant every syllable of it. The Alsonby estate was a real thing, a house in Devonshire, a trust account that had grown quietly for 7 years, a name that had weight in maritime circles and had simply been waiting for someone to claim it. Gosse was tried that winter. The Edinburgh certificate was unimpeachable. Sybil's testimony was thorough and merciless, delivered in that same clear, level voice she had used in the street, sparing herself nothing and sparing him less. He was convicted of bigamy and conspiracy and received a sentence that took him far from England for a very long time. When they led him from the dock, he looked toward the gallery where Adeline sat beside the Duke's sister, a forthright, practical woman who had taken Adeline in without ceremony and asked nothing she wasn't ready to answer. Whatever Gosse hoped to find in Adeline's face, he did not find it. She looked back at him steadily, without rancor, the way one looks at a difficult road finally left behind, and then she looked away. Sybil left England that spring for the continent, where a clever woman with a hard head might begin again. Before she went, she wrote Adeline a letter. It was short and contained no apology, because Sybil was not a woman who apologized. It said only, "You were quieter than I took you for, and stronger. I did you a great wrong. I will not insult you by asking pardon for it, but I am glad, in the end, that he did not win. Live well." It was signed with her name alone. Adeline read it twice. She folded it away and did not answer it, but she did not burn it either. She had learned, in that damp rented house, exactly how a woman with no good choices comes to make bad ones. She did not speak of Sybil afterward with anything sharper than a kind of weary understanding. She took possession of the Devonshire house as the leaves were turning. It was a strange homecoming to a place she had never seen, that had been her family's for 2 generations, and that she had come within 6 days of never knowing existed. She went through it room by room, the gardens gone a little wild, the furniture under Holland covers, dust on the window ledges, and light coming through anyway. In the front hall she found a portrait of her grandfather, a weathered man with a merchant's face, and nothing of the drawing-room about him, with something in the set of his jaw that she recognized immediately. Beside it, in a smaller frame, a woman she had never seen but knew at once, her grandmother. The same hands, the same stillness around the mouth. She stood before them for a long time. In the long gallery, she found among the old portraits a painting of an older woman, proud, self-contained, wearing at her throat a cameo brooch, small and oval, jet and white. The same cameo Adeline had worn every day of her adult life, the same one Gosse had taken, and that had since been returned to her. She reached up and touched it now, warm and worn at the edges, and understood what it had always been. Not merely her father's last gift to her, but her grandmother's message carried forward in the only form that might survive the silence between them. You were always mine, it said, in the language of objects rather than words. I could not reach you, but I sent this ahead. Adeline stood in the gallery for a long time, with her hand against the brooch and the winter light coming pale through the windows, and she thought that being found, even after everything, was still a kind of miracle. The Duke came to call on a bright afternoon in late spring, and they walked in the garden together, the 2 of them with a maid at a respectful distance. They spoke of the house and the season and the state of the roses, and then they did not speak, and then he stopped. I have something to say, he said. I've been waiting to say it until I was certain I was saying it at the right time, and for the right reasons. He looked at her directly. When I first saw you, you were bound to a situation you had not chosen, with nothing of your own and no real freedom to choose anything, whatever you might have said to me then. However you might have answered anything I asked, would have been the answer of a woman without options. A woman without options cannot give anything freely, because she has nothing free to give. He paused. So I waited until you had your name and your house and your fortune, and needed nothing from anyone on this earth, least of all from me. I waited until you could say no without losing anything by it, and walk back into that house and be perfectly well without me for the rest of your days. His voice was even, but she could hear what it cost him to keep it so. And now that you can, I find I must ask anyway. I love you. I think I have loved you since a cold afternoon in a portrait gallery when you told me not to be kind to you because you couldn't bear it. I have been kind to a great many people out of duty, and felt nothing. I was not prepared to feel this. He looked at her steadily. I am asking you to marry me, not because you need a protector, for you need none now. Not because it would restore anything, for you have restored everything yourself. Only because I love you, and I should like very much to spend the rest of my life proving it, if you will let me. He waited. Adeline stood in the spring garden with sunlight on the roses, and thought of the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing in a borrowed room, teaching herself to want nothing, because wanting was the shortest road to disappointment. She thought of how that woman would have wept to hear these words, and said yes out of relief and hunger and the terror of being alone, and meant something quite different by it than love. She was not that woman any longer. That, she understood, was exactly why he had waited. You said I could remember your kindness as long as I liked, she said. You said you would not take it back. "I haven't," he said, "not once." "No." She looked at him. "Not once. Not on the worst days, when I had nothing and no reason to believe it was real." She was quiet for a moment. "I have spent my whole life being moved from place to place by other people's choices. You are the first person who ever waited to be chosen." She took his hand. "Yes," she said, "with everything I am, freely and without reservation, yes." They were married in the small church at the edge of the Devonshire estate on a clear morning in late summer, in the presence of the solicitors and the Duke's sister and the old housekeeper, who had stayed on through all the years the house stood empty, and who wept with a forthrightness she made no effort to conceal. Adeline walked up the aisle alone. There was no one to give her away, and she had decided, deliberately and without regret, that she preferred it. She had been given away once already, in a church, to a man who had manufactured the entire occasion for his own use. She would not be given away again. She would give herself, by her own choosing, to the man who had stood at the end of a muddy street with no proof and no power, and told her to hold on. When the minister asked who gave this woman, Adeline answered herself in the clear and unhurried voice she had found in a gray street and kept. "I do," she said. And the Duke of Wrenfield, hearing it, understood everything she meant, and took her hand, and did not let it go. The years that followed were quiet and full and ordinary, in all the ways that mattered most. Adeline became, in time, a woman about whom people said, with a note of slightly puzzled admiration, that she had a way of seeking out whoever was least attended to in a room. At gatherings and dinners she would find them, the woman seated below her proper station, the young relation hovering at the edge of things, the guest who had arrived without a proper introduction and could not quite catch anyone's eye. She would go to them and sit with them and make certain they were known, and that their glass was filled, and that by the time the evening ended, they had been seen by someone who mattered. Most people thought it a charming eccentricity. None of them understood it, because none of them had ever stood by a fireplace in a borrowed dress and been given away in their own name to a stranger, in front of a room full of people who did not look twice. But the women she sought out understood. She had made herself a private promise in a cold gallery, addressed to no one in particular: "I cannot bear kindness." Over the years that followed, she kept the second half of that promise which she had never spoken aloud, "So I will learn to give it instead." And she kept it without calculation or sentiment, simply because she knew better than most what it cost a person to do without it, and because, knowing that, she could not in good conscience look away. Adeline Stowe, Duchess of Wrenfield, who had once stood invisible in other people's drawing rooms and been served last at other people's tables, lived to see her daughter grow up unafraid in the house that had always been hers, grow up certain and clear-eyed and entirely unacquainted with the habit of making herself small, which was precisely, in the end, what Adeline had intended from the very first.